Hello, everyone, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the country. Thank you so much for joining us. This is Michael Klein from the Institute for Security and Technology, coming to you live from beautiful Boston, Massachusetts, where they are resurfacing everything in front of my building right now. So if it starts to shake or gets very loud for a moment, my apologies, but we're going to make it through. Um, and I'm really excited to be joined today by some amazing guests. We are going to get introductions from them in just a few minutes. And today we are here talking about managing third-party risk after the PowerSchool incident, 60 million reasons to rethink vendor management. And we'll be joined in just a minute by Vanessa Wren, Chief Information Officer from the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, Heather Mahoney, Executive Director from the Mohawk Regional Information Center in New York, and Mark Williams, Partner at F3 Law. And before we go to those intros, I wanted to do a little bit of level setting and helping everyone understand kind of what the lay of the land looks like in K-12 cybersecurity, the kind of work that we've been doing from the kind of federal, state, and local levels, and then be able to dive into this rich conversation with some wonderful experts from across the country. So to get us started really quickly, I am the Senior Director for Preparedness and Response at the Institute for Security and Technology. I'm newly here as of just a few months ago. IST is a wonderful critical action think tank. So we don't just think big thoughts, we also do great things. And we focus on the intersection of technology, technology policy, and national security, looking at emerging security challenges. This looks at things from nuclear risk reduction all the way to our very famous ransomware task force, which does some wonderful work, as well as a big focus we have on AI, trust and safety, and other topics as well. And so I'm really excited to be able to bring a K-12 focus to the work that we do at IST, having worked just recently at the US Department of Education, where I was leading our K-12 cyber policy efforts as a senior advisor. And to give you a sense of what's going on in the education space, as you probably know, many of you are from districts, many of you from state agencies, the speed, scope, and impact of cyber threats to schools continues to increase. We're seeing roughly 5 cyber incidents per week impacting K-12. You've likely seen them in the local towns around you, maybe at the state agencies around you. Everything from disruptive ransomware attacks, where threat actors are able to get into systems and shut down those systems, preventing access and sometimes stopping school from being able to go. And we see those about once a week or so. We also see some school districts who felt compelled to pay those ransoms because they maybe didn't have the backups to be able to get back up and running again, or they were worried about the release of that data that maybe had also been stolen by those threat actors. We also see business email compromise, really extorting school districts or stealing money through fraud from those school districts, pretending to be a vendor that maybe they were using, or getting into someone's email and being able to change the routing number on payments. And of course, ransomware causing a lot of downtime and cost across the world, especially over the last 5 years. But this isn't something that's just at the local school district level. And that's really our focus today, is going to be on third-party risk in K-12 cybersecurity. And while this sounds like a big deal or kind of a confusing topic, it's really just risk that you yourself as a school district don't manage and have kind of handed off to another party that you may or may not have so much control over. And so some instances of this, the most recent was obviously the PowerSchool incident, which impacted about 60 million students and 10 million teachers. This was announced by PowerSchool in early January when I was still at the department, and worked closely with the White House and FBI and others, as well as many of the districts and states, to try to figure out the impacts and how we could mitigate the harms of this incident. We also had this happen earlier, though. This is not just a PowerSchool thing, and I don't want this webinar to feel like a beat up on PowerSchool. It's actually just an opportunity to talk about the broader challenges and risk given this particular recent event. We also had Snowflake, which is a vendor that did a lot of data analysis for school districts and other kinds of entities that was also hit in a similar way, as well as Raptor Technologies a couple of years ago now, maybe about a year ago now, which held incredibly sensitive records about school safety. And so this shows you that in these instances, it's not just one school district that's being impacted, but potentially hundreds or thousands of school districts all at once. And sometimes those districts don't have very much control over whether or not those incidents occur, right? That risk is often held by the third-party vendor, and so requires a lot of diligence on the part of districts and others to try to mitigate against that. For those of you who are outside of education, it's maybe helpful to just give a quick lay of the land and kind of map the awesome people that we have today to these different pieces. In the US, we have about 100,000 schools. They fall into about 14,000 school districts. You probably think of the largest most often, New York City, LA, Chicago. But in fact, the vast majority of our school districts are quite small. 70% of our districts have 2,500 students or fewer. They maybe have one person who does IT, maybe a couple. In Oregon, you have kind of a median district size of 600 students. So your superintendent may drive the bus and fix printers on the weekend. So the capacity is often not there in terms of protecting yourself from a big nation state actor or from a cyber criminal group. And so thankfully, we have great organizations like educational service agencies around the country that help at a regional level, provide support, especially to those smallest and most rural districts. And that's where Heather Mahoney is from. She's going to speak about that in just a little bit in the New York context. Of course, then we have state agencies. We have 50 states, 5 territories in DC. And Vanessa will be able to speak to that experience of how states are approaching these kinds of challenges. And then even within states, we have multiple departments. We have departments of education in some states that are leading this work. In other states, it's State Department of IT. In other states, we might have a research education network that's providing internet services. And then I think the other piece we really want to hit on here is there are elements of education that are really critical infrastructure, right? These are the things that if you were to hit this kind of a system and take it down, you wouldn't have students going to school that day. Here we're talking about student information systems that tell us who can pick up a student from school, has all of the relevant data on that student and family, bus routing systems that get our students safely to and from school every day, food service and lunch systems that make sure our students get warm meals. For many students, this is one or two of the warm meals they get every day. IEP and special education systems, ERP and finance. We have amazing teachers, but if you stop paying them, eventually they stop coming to school. And then other systems like single sign-on, multi-factor, these get a little bit more technical, and then email and file sharing. And while this can start to feel overwhelming, we're actually only talking about 20 to 30 vendors that make up almost the entirety of the market across these different sectors, right? And so what we see with instances like whether it's PowerSchool or Raptor Technologies or others, Illuminate a couple of years ago, is that an impact on one of these vendors can have downstream effects on thousands of school districts and millions of students. And so that's the thing we're really trying to mitigate against when we talk about third-party risk. From a federal perspective, when I was at the department, one of the main things we did was really focus on lifting and shifting the burden. As I mentioned, many of our districts are quite small and don't have the capacity to do a lot of work on cybersecurity. And one of our great people, Kemba Walden, said, we expect school districts to go toe-to-toe with transnational criminal organizations, largely by themselves. This isn't just unfair, it's ineffective. And so we need more to be done by a few actors, right? By the federal government, by state governments, by educational service agencies, and by the vendors themselves, right? Because that's where a lot of the risk lies. So are we making any progress, right? This is something we've been talking about for years now. And I think people sometimes despair and feel like actually nothing is going well. And I think we're actually starting to make some great progress in the last several years. We've elevated this to a national level conversation. We had amazing folks like Vanessa and others from the state and district level kind of representing how important this topic was in the White House. We had tons of media coverage around these issues. We put out very specific guidance with different agencies to really target specific things that districts could do to improve their cybersecurity practice, things as simple as using multi-factor authentication or making sure they had secure backups and had practiced using their backups. So all those things we know to be best practice. And then, of course, bringing together all of the relevant stakeholder groups in an ongoing way to try to mitigate this risk together, because this isn't a problem that one person can solve. This is not just an IT problem. This is an issue that superintendents understand. This is something that school boards need to think about because it has financial implications and financial risk. It's also something that states and even at the federal level we need to think about. And so being able to bring all those groups together on an ongoing basis has been a really big part of the puzzle for us. And so those high impact recommendations we talked about are not going to be surprising to anyone on this call. This is not on the third party risk side. This is just on the basic side, right? Compromising valid accounts, right? Most people get popped with one of three things happening. Either someone goes online and finds a username and password that still works on an account and can log in, which is what happened in the PowerSchool incident. Users can be convinced to click on a link or download something that puts malware on a computer, gives access. Or if we have unpatched vulnerabilities, those can sometimes be used to infiltrate a school district. And so, of course, we say use multi-factor authentication. That will stop many of these challenges because even if you have the username and password, if you're required to have a physical device like a key or type in a code, that adds another layer of protection. Obviously, using strong passwords and different ones for each is important. Recognizing and reporting phishing and updating your software. But this is where I get to introduce all of my friends on the call with what can we do right now, right? Because we've started to do things that address this disruptive ransomware threat in our school districts. We see much, from the anecdata we have and talking with districts, much higher adoption of multi-factor authentication, much higher adoption of secure backups, and of doing tabletop exercises to think through what we do in the incident when the incident actually happens. But how do we think about this third-party risk challenge? And so this is where I'm going to take down my slides, stop sharing my screen, and introduce my amazing friends. And so here I'd like to start with Vanessa, and then go around to Heather and then Mark. Can you tell us a little bit about who you are, what your role is, and how you support K-12 cybersecurity?
Hey, thank you, Michael. What a great introduction to this talk today. I'm Vanessa Wren. I am the Chief Information Officer for the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. North Carolina has about 1.6 million public school students in our state, and we have 2,800 schools. We consist of 115 local education agencies and about 250 charter schools that we support, just like they're a public school. We have had a statewide student information system in North Carolina since 1980. And we are one of the largest state customers of a state student information system. So it certainly has a lot of impact when you're coming from our point of view. We probably provide more managed and shared services to our schools than many states do. And that is just around the history we have of data. We are one of the states that's had a state longitudinal data system for education data for close to 35 years now. So like many education institutions, we are very data rich, basically because we have had that critical system in place for so long. We've had a long history of providing that. We also provide, and this is all new within the last 4 years, a lot of centralized cybersecurity tools for our schools. We don't act as a full SOC, but we are trying to get close to that. We provide our schools, endpoint protection, network asset discovery, content filtering, firewalls. All of this is at no cost to their schools. So it all comes together in our data-rich infrastructure, mainly because we do uniform education reporting. And so all of this works together hand in hand. So that paints a little picture for us in North Carolina, and what we do and what I do as a CIO to help manage those things. My goal is to make our modern school system as simplified as possible for our local schools.
That's really helpful. And so if I could make a quick synopsis of what you just said, it sounds like you all have been doing a couple of things, a lot of things very well, but a couple of things that include not just helping with determining which systems should be used, but actually procuring systems on behalf of school districts where you have a statewide student information system. Every district is using that system, and that feeds up into the state system. And that allows you a lot more ability to support districts with securing those systems, as well as providing endpoint detection and other things that really do shore up those things at the local district level as well.
Yes, well said, Michael. Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Heather, can you tell us a little bit about what it's like to be at a RIC and the great work that you do?
Sure. So I work for one of the 12 regional information centers in New York State. So our job is to serve as an educational service provider for school districts and really supplement their capacity in terms of technology and data. So, as I indicated, I work for one. So I, in particular, work with 50 school districts. And then there are 11 other regional information centers. Collectively, we support over 700 school districts. And really today I consider myself representing all 12 because we do a lot of this work collaboratively. So in 2014, New York State had a new data privacy and security law. We call it Education Law 2D, includes lots of provisions for vendors in terms of the protection of data, as well as some implications for school districts. And we've really worked collaboratively to help all 700 school districts comply with that law. And that meant making it practical, making it reasonable, and really listening to school districts when there were pain points. And then about 2 years ago, the RICS also recognized that in addition to focusing on data privacy and security collaboratively, there was a lot of movement to the cloud, and there had been for some time, but that this was bigger than just data security and privacy, but about vendor management holistically. And we started a new partnership, and we call it the Risk Operations Center. And we're really working together to certainly focus on the protection of data, but we're also focused on product performance. We're focused on the value that school districts get when they enter into relationships with contractors and making sure they're fully satisfied. And so our role is to really be responsive to school districts' needs and help them to continue to have stronger partnerships with vendors and achieve better outcomes.
That's really helpful. And it sounds like, you have a state where you have the largest district in the country at 1.1 million students, and then some of the smallest districts in the country as well. And you're trying to ensure that all of them are secure through this kind of collaborative effort between the legislature that passes the law, the state education agency that is in charge of doing a lot of the privacy work, and then the ESAs, the RICs, that are actually implementing that work in practice with the school districts. And so it's a really helpful collaboration between all those different levels of government in a way that we don't see in every state. That's really great. And Mark, can you tell us a little bit about what you do, and how you support K-12
Sure,
cybersecurity? It's a little
Michael.
bit different.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mark Williams. I'm a partner with the law firm of Fagan, Friedman, and Fullfrost, and I work in the e-Matters department. I specialize in data privacy and cybersecurity. Um, I think the thing that I am involved in the most is I was the original author of the National Data Privacy Agreement, which was then adopted by A4L and SDPC, and I've worked on with the committee there to update it over the years. I'm also general counsel for A4L, Site, and EdTech JPA, which is a digital services procurement agency. And in doing that, I've negotiated lots and lots of data privacy agreements and master services agreement with technology companies.
Mark, can you do a couple of acronym checks for us? Because I think we probably have people from various backgrounds who may or may not know any of the words that are coming out of your mouth in terms of the acronyms. So can you maybe take a step back and tell us a little bit about the Student Data Privacy Consortium, SDPC, and the work that they've done on the National Data Privacy Agreement? Because I think that that's a really helpful mechanism that many districts and states have used to try to put some teeth behind the kinds of agreements that they sign with vendors. And so can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Just like a lawyer to throw out a bunch of complex terms. The SDPC is a Student Data Privacy Consortium, and it's association of both companies and state education associations. It's headquartered in Boston. Steve Smith is a CEO, and their job is to collect for public use data privacy agreements that follow our agreement. And what we try to do is take a middle road between vendor needs for the contract and public education agencies for their contract. And so we have a centralized registry of approved contracts.
Awesome. That is super helpful. So now that we're well acquainted with each other, Vanessa, can you tell us a little bit about how you were thinking about third-party risk management prior to the PowerSchool incident? So what kinds of things did you all have in place, and what were you kind of tracking and thinking about?
Yeah, I'll be glad to share that. So in North Carolina, what we had in place was a data sharing agreement. And for any of our schools to connect to any of our state centralized systems, such as our SIS, we had in place data sharing agreement. A few years prior, we had a list of approved vendors where we would vet, and we would vet them by third-party evaluation, NIST 853, pen testing, and what we call vendor readiness. We have always seen, and we always knew that our biggest threats came from human error and third-party integrations. And that just over the years could easily pinpoint to those two spots. So we try to control for what we can control for. We were getting to where we just could not respond fast to our school's needs by having the vendors that we were approving. So 2.5, 3 years ago, we put in place what we called our Department of Public Instruction data sharing agreement, where we highlighted for all of our schools what they needed to be looking for with their vendors, and making sure that they understood what controls were in place with that. So those were the things that we had in place before. We also had our own single sign-on platform where we put these resources behind that window. We were also the first state agency in our state to put MFA in place. And that was very important to us as well. It's not necessarily directed to the third-party vendor, but it certainly helped in controlling access to that and who could be there. So we were looking at this as how we could better train our schools to understand what risks they're entering into when they have a third-party vendor in place. And we heightened that severely if that third-party vendor at a school connected to our state system, primarily that was connecting to our single sign-on system, or plugging into our student information system for rostering, or those types of things. So having those controls in place were important. We relied on that third-party evaluation framework, typically SOC 2 Type 2, and making sure that it was an approved person or approved company for SOC 2 Type 2. And we also worked hand in hand with our centralized IT in the state. Any procurement we did at the state level, we worked with them and we showed proof of that. And we annually reviewed those. For any contract that we held here at our agency, we had to have an annual updated SOC 2 Type 2. And then for critical systems, we went a step further and had pen testing in place as well. So those are some of the pieces that we had in place. Data sharing agreement, SOC 2 Type 2, penetration testing, and then separate data sharing agreements that we provided for our schools. And then routine reviews of where our data rests. But we certainly have changed that. I won't get ahead of myself, but those were some of the things that we had in place. But our goal was also around training. We did a lot of training with our schools around cybersecurity and best practices, tabletop exercises. We even provide I'm sure many of you use this, the Know Before platform, because again, that human error, and then if I can tighten that up along with tightening up the understanding of the risk with third-party integrations, that's where we were. And those are the things that we have been doing, and we thought we were in pretty good shape with those things.
That's super helpful. So let me highlight a couple things you said that I think are important to note, because some states may not be doing these yet and might want to be thinking about these particular things. So I think number one, your question about does it plug into our state student information system? And do we have an increased level of visibility and rigor that we look at in terms of whether that system can then pull data in or push data in or pull data out of it, right? So I think that's really key, right, to those core systems. And then I think another thing you said was penetration testing. And for those people that are not from the world of cybersecurity or IT, what we're talking about here is an active good guy attacking like a bad guy the systems that we're going to be using, right? Because the expectation is that bad guys are doing this all the time. And it's really important that we have people who are looking for those same vulnerabilities, trying to exploit them, and then sharing that information with the vendors to be able to say, we found some things, you're always going to find something, please patch this or make sure that this is strong enough for us, right? That goes a level beyond what many people might be doing already.
And I'll add, Michael, too, you just jogged my memory. And I think it's germane to this conversation. We worked hard to get legislation in place in North Carolina, and we do have it in place, that no state agency or local agency can pay ransomware. That's something we really worked hard. We wanted to be just as unattractive as possible to threat actors. So we work with that. And then, of course, we work with partners who do public scans of our IP addresses, and we keep those public scans running all the time.
Awesome. This is great. This is like all the stuff you would want to see in terms of being able to spot, are there vulnerabilities on equipment that's facing the internet that maybe we haven't seen yet? Are we making sure that everything is as locked down as possible? These are all the things you'd want to see. Heather, take us to what you were doing at the RIC prior to these incidents. How were you all thinking about third-party risk and managing that?
Sure. So similar to Vanessa, also focused on data privacy agreements as a starting point, right? Before you enter into an agreement, you want to make sure you have a strong service agreement, including a data protection agreement. Our law is pretty robust and specific about what vendors must do. So they must, for example, comply with the NIST cybersecurity framework. And so for 10 years, we've had pretty common data privacy agreements in place, but they weren't the same. And we were in a transitional period. We still are. Thanks to Mark's good work, we've been transitioning over to the A4L National Data Privacy Agreement and leveraging that. And one of the reasons that we really feel like that's important is then we move from a few standardized, fairly common agreements to the same agreement. And that allows us to communicate more effectively with vendors about what our expectations are. It allows us to know what those expectations are because they're the same across all vendors. They're the same for all school districts. So we have been really working on standardizing the data protection agreement as a starting point. Another thing that we were working on is, okay, now that you've sourced the product, you've implemented it, you want to make sure that on an ongoing basis, we're taking a look at those vendors and making sure they're doing what they say that they are doing in those contracts. So that looks at like assurance programs, looking at those different certification products that they have in place. I will say that our efforts to do that has been with mixed success. And so we are looking to partner with other states to make that reasonable for vendors so that vendors can do that once for all school districts across the nation. And that can be a robust and rigorous process, but also reasonable for our vendors and thinking about which things we care most about, because as you may know, this cybersecurity framework has 108 controls. That's a lot to look at. So what are those high ticket items like MFA that you noted that we might want to pay more attention to? And then we were starting to think a little bit more about making sure the 700 school districts were paying attention to things like data destruction and making sure they were taking advantage of exhibits that are in our standardized national DPA that allows them to communicate their data destruction desires to vendors as they offboard products or want to get rid of certain data sets within an existing solution. So just continuing to build upon those pieces is where we were when PowerSchool hit. Lots of good work, lots of room for more growth.
This is a perfect transition. And then I want to toss it back to Heather and Vanessa on this one. As we moved into this world of this large scale incident, one of the things that we saw was a host of districts that had a lot of historical data in the system up further than 10 years back, right? And so this does speak to those data management practices And as a former IT director in a school district, honestly, my eyes glazed over when anyone talked to me about data destruction and data deletion. And you have to keep it for 7 years, but then after 7 years, you have this much time to do this thing. And it's different in every state. So like it's complicated, especially if you're like one person trying to manage a whole school district's kind of data infrastructure. But it does speak to the impact, right? The blast radius of having an incident like this, right? Because even when we do have incidents, if we can mitigate it so only 1 year's worth of data was in the system that got hit, that's very different in terms of the impact on children and parents and families than if it's 13 years of data for students that have long since graduated, right? So it does speak to that really big challenge there. So I'm going to take us from that and transition us into the conversation of the PowerSchool incident that we all kind of experienced, and wanted to toss to Vanessa in just a minute. But I wanted to first call out that North Carolina has a joint cyber task force, right? So this is a task force that's composed of multiple state agencies, including the National Guard, as well as the FBI at the federal level, and then multiple institutions across the state, as well as school districts, and then a joint strike force that could go out and try to really address incidents, whether it's a disruptive ransomware attack and you're sending someone out to actually help the district, or whether it's like this incident that occurred where we now need to figure out like, oh my gosh, what is the impact? Do we know yet? Right. And so talk us through a little bit, Vanessa, kind of like how you managed the third party relationships here and any other incidents too. If you've had other third party incidents, like how was that experience for you in terms of what worked well, given the structures you had created, or things that, you know, you might want to have gone another way?
Right. Yeah. So we created, I think it's almost 3 years ago now, at our agency, a position solely focused on our school's cybersecurity. So they could work with the many partners in North Carolina. And so we created this position to be the liaison, if you will, to work with our joint cybersecurity task force, a person that our schools recognized and trusted. To come in as soon as they have an incident and have boots on the ground. And that person is prepared to move and get to that school system as soon as something happens. So that was one of the critical things, because you've got so many, you know, you've got CISA, you've got things in North Carolina, we've got our National Guard. We needed someone who could be the controller, if you will, of those supports. And so our schools know exactly who they call. How do I pull the lever of the state protocols that kick in whenever something like this happens? And with the PowerSchool incident, we had trained our schools so well. Oh, you need to immediately report to this number that you have this. And so they were calling us and saying, do we all need a report? Are you going to do that for us? And so, you know, having that in place was actually good, because it let me know that our schools are listening. And some of them called up and reported to, of course, our, you know, Attorney General's office and our centralized IT and to us. But we were quickly able to get that messaging out to say, this is a state event. Yes, it has impacted all of you. But as the state holder of the contract, we are making sure that your FERPA notifications and your protocol notifications are in place, and letting them know that. So there was some good and bad to that, to know that they were taking it very seriously and wanting to
Let me pause you.
happen.
Let me pause you there for a second, because I think for so many school districts, that first part about like, what do I even do now? Do I need to notify myself? Is the vendor going to notify? Is the state going to notify? Having clarity on that piece of the puzzle, while it seems small, is actually quite big in terms of managing your risk and knowing when you talk to your school board, this part of the puzzle is covered, right? We have these other things we need to think about in terms of sharing with our community, helping people understand the impact, but this legal obligation has been taken care of.
That's right. And if there was one thing I wish could have happened differently with this specific event, is we were notified after our schools. Our schools were getting notifications up to an hour before we knew. And so we felt like with the lead time with that PowerSchool knew, it would have been really nice if we could have had a 24-hour notice, or we would have taken a 1-hour notice. Because the communication part of this one is so critical, because parents immediately are calling the building. And then you have our school board attorneys reaching out immediately. And so the communication component is probably one of the most critical pieces. And so one of the things that, I don't want to get ahead to, I know we're going to look at what we're doing after, but in the moment is who is communicating. So we quickly stood up our comms team, and I have to give incredible kudos to our public instruction comms team, because we quickly stood up a war room as soon as we were getting notification and said, okay, we are communicating this to these stakeholder groups now. And we were communicating almost on the hour and definitely daily. And so being able to do that, we stood up webinars quickly with our school board attorneys, with our school superintendents, with our school principals, our school IT directors, and also with our school public information officers, to make sure that we were getting out one communication, one voice. And so certainly the first thing we had to do there in the living in it was to confirm, because mixed messages were coming to the school. No, you weren't impacted. Oh, and then yes, you were impacted. So they were getting multiple mixed messages. So we quickly had to move to confirm that the school was impacted, and then confirming what data was breached. And so there's a lot of lessons learned from that. And we did that literally within 48 hours. And we're talking about 20 years of data for North Carolina in this system that we've been in for almost 15 years. And so being able to confirm that very quickly, and then teaching our schools how they can go into their student information system and see for themselves how to extract those tables that were impacted was part of that communication outreach that we did. So I think the biggest piece here is the communication. Who's doing what? How does it need to happen? And getting out in front of that. Even though the vendor was very good at providing templates, and they did a good job saying, this is how you should communicate to your parents, this is how you should communicate to your students, the schools were calling us and saying, is it okay to use this? Should we use this? Again, we are the contract holder. So we also created templates that said, hey, this is good. However, we recommend that you do this. So we absolutely were able to have information templates that we sent out to communicate with former educators in the system, educators that had a social security number involved, educators who did not. Luckily, it didn't impact our students with many social security numbers, but we did have some. So we had multiple types of templates around the communication piece for our schools. And again, having that one person who our schools knew to pick up that hotline call before this happened was very important. So we knew there was someone that they could call and get this to, and getting out in front of that communication. I think one of the most brilliant things we did was the rumor mill starts happening very quickly. And so I think one of the most brilliant things we did, and certainly I'll put this in my toolkit now, but it was just luck at the time, was getting a joint quick meeting together with school superintendents and their local board attorneys. Because they immediately were getting the questions from the parents around, what are my rights? I'm going to sue you. Those types of things. Mark, you can pick this one up when I get done. So being able to say to our local board attorneys, and that's a big group, right? There's 320 of them in North Carolina, that this is what we know. This is what state law says. This is where we are with our federal partners, and this is what we're doing. And then being able to be very transparent with our schools about the amount of data and the specific data counts we provided to them so they could validate exactly what was exfiltrated in their district. So I think those were one of the biggest things. And then constant communication, and that communication included, to our state board, and other partners as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. There were so many gems there that we will pull out in a minute. I want to give Mark a minute to speak to the PowerSchool incident moment. And then Heather, if you can speak to it from your perspective, and then we're going to dive into what are we doing now? Now that we know these issues happen and we know what the controls are that fell through, maybe, how are we thinking about this next?
Hi. It was a scattered response at first. We didn't get all of the information at one time. And part of it was, how do we manage the response? How do we manage communicating with PowerSchool? And I was telling my clients that the district should be doing the communicating, because if PowerSchool was shaping the message, it may not have be shaped in a way that's of interest to the school districts. Michael, should I talk about the litigation a little bit? Or
Yeah, if you want to speak for a minute about the litigation, just the approach, because I think it is one way that districts think about managing risk, right? Is on the front end, kind of through contracting and things like that, and then on the back end through trying to make themselves whole through the process, right? To try to recoup the money and things that they may be lost. Yeah.
Sure. Very quickly, from our perspective, from the lawyer's perspective, we had two consequences from the PowerSchool. How do we hold them legally accountable for what occurred? And the other is, how do we change the DPA and how do we negotiate terms of service differently now that PowerSchool has stress tested those instruments? And I can talk a little bit about this later in the show, but we decided to do what's called a mass action lawsuit, which is a little different from a class action lawsuit.
Awesome, thank you. And then we'll toss to Heather for a minute. And Heather, you can transition us from the incident into how you're working on this now. And then we'll just pick up and talk about third-party risk management now.
Sure. So following PowerSchool, we really felt that New York State did a good job responding to it, but it doesn't mean it was perfect, and there was definitely lessons learned. So following the PowerSchool incident, we convened in Albany, where our state education department is located, a group of colleagues, and we had cybersecurity experts. We had that specialized in K-12. We had RIC directors similar to myself. We had attorneys. We had state education leaders. A lot of different colleagues come together, and we basically did a facilitated after action review. And then we also worked on our vendor management multi-year plan to reprioritize the scope of work in terms of what we would tackle collaboratively and have the most value for our state, because there are a lot of things on that list that we intend to get to over time. So it was a great opportunity for people to really come together and, again, with purpose, look intentionally at a specific incident and think about how can we continue to build together. And I think one of the things Vanessa said that really resonates with me is communication continues to be one of the biggest challenges in these situations, right? You can never outrun sort of the information getting out to the public. And so how can we be responsive to that? How does that impact our thinking? How do we leverage that? So we're really trying to create structures where New York State school districts can report to us if they hear something in the media. We get information from partners like K-12-6 to sometimes that gives us 24 hours before a lot of the public knows. And really trying to also stand up accessible areas that New York State school districts can go to get New York State specific information. So we're thinking about standing up a website, for example, with common resources, and really trying to standardize the process. So a lot of work around communication and strategic planning.
Amazing. I'm always blown away by all the work that you're doing. So I want to give you a couple thoughts from my perspective and then toss it back to you on what you think will be most impactful moving forward. So from my perspective, and I'll kind of share my priors on this one, right? So I was at the department. We had done this work of convening these government coordinating council, right, that includes state chiefs and superintendents and school boards and all these groups. And so immediately after we found out the incident occurred, we pulled all those groups together. We shared, how is this impacting you? And then within a few days, we were able to pull together 41 states and Guam at the state level, right? So from state CIOs and state education leaders, state emergency managers, even a couple of folks from Attorney's General office, to understand like what's going on in your context. This is impacting people differently in different places, and we want to make sure that we can support you through this. And so I think from that experience, having those convening mechanisms and also those great partners like K-12-6 to be able to share information really quickly back and forth, and federal partners like FBI. I happen to live down the street from the person who put handcuffs on the 19-year-old who did this. So these are like relationships that we build over time that lead to these kinds of things, right? And so as we're moving forward, the one thing I want to see more of, I would say, is can we get everybody to have multi-factor authentication for the vendor that is phishing resistant, YubiKey, for anyone that touches student, staff, or teacher data, right? Is there a reason why that's not possible? I'm sure there is. I'm sure there are edge cases. I'm sure some things wouldn't be stopped by this, right? But like this feels like bare minimum, right? What are the other things that you all are thinking about in terms of those risk mitigations? How are you approaching this challenge? Let's go Vanessa, then Mark, then Heather.
So, Michael, I've hit it from two different categories. Number one is data governance and totally looking at our data and limiting where we put our data, how we share our data, accurate inventory of where our data is at, and what encryption of that data, retooling the architecture, if you will, of the data. And we have pushed so long for cloud architecture and those things, but there were so many pieces of this that was outside of my control. So I would say data governance was a big piece of that. And then of course, technical controls in that. You mentioned MFA. Like I said, we had MFA in place and according to, the forensics of this, there was MFA in most all of it, except for one of the most important places, and that was the administrative tunnel. Which we as a state agency didn't have access to. And to me, that was a critical place to make sure you have MFA and VPN in place. One of the technical controls that I'll be looking at under the governance piece, and maybe I would do contracting, is, I said two categories. Let me hit the second category. The second category, any third-party vendor I'm working with now, I'm looking at them through the lens of a trusted data stewardship partner. Not a vendor. I want a vendor that I can come to and they are going to be my trusted data stewardship partner. I'll have data governance in place. And as part of that, that's where I'm going to look at the technical controls, certainly MFA in place. As I said, we put a lot of time and energy every year around ensuring our vendors we do business with have up-to-date SOC 2 Type 2, and that they have remediated any mitigations that came out of their CVEs of that. And we did a lot. So I was a bit disappointed in all of the work we have done with that and knowing this vendor had that in place. So I know I need to go a step further. One of the things I'm going to be looking at are exfil controls, right? There should be some rate control on any data that's extracted from a vendor. And so that's something that, when I look at, I've talked about, FedRAMP is wonderful, but right now I'm looking at a state ramp for North Carolina, a gov ramp for North Carolina, and what I would have in place in my contract T's and C's would certainly be some exfiltration controls. When you look at just the sheer amount of data that was exfiltrated over many, many days, there are controls in place that could stop that type of thing. And then being able to have some intrusion detection as well. And certainly we know that's a moving target, but that's also something that I will be looking at, and the ability to audit that. I have in place now no offshore access to data. And we do know that, this was an offshore contract worker. And I was certainly hoping, and I'm sorry if I don't mean to be bad with this, but I wanted it to be some kind of, really high sophisticated operative that breached the system. But to know it was a 19-year-old in Boston hurt my feelings just a little bit because I felt like we were doing all these things. So when I look at those T's and C's, I want to be able to have some audit compliance. With critical data, I need to be able to have some assurances beyond SOC 2 Type 2 with some audit compliance in place, and then be able to also have language that we can limit data sharing, and we also can end our contracts as we need to if these things aren't being followed. And we know some of these systems are too hard to lift and shift, but that can't get in the way of being able to say, we will, stop the relationship if you cannot be our trusted data steward partner, because that's really what the lens has to be. And we have to all agree that we're going to put some of these pieces in place, and MFA everywhere, roles, right? Role access control. And, we talk about a zero trusted environment. It has to be at every step of the way. You cannot have fractions of the data environment where that is not in place. We have spent hours of our life, and I mean hours, that's probably as in months, still remediating this. We've had to build back trust with our parents, and some of that currency you can't get back. So I think it's really important now that any vendor that I partner with has got to be a vendor who wants to partner with me and be a data steward of our citizens' data.
Amazing. Thank you. Let's toss over to Mark, then we'll come to Heather, and then I will kind of close us out.
Sure. From my perspective, I think what this incident has done is pressure test the DPA and pressure test how we negotiate terms of service. So on the DPA side, I think we need to tighten up and close any loopholes that have developed in the data disposal section. The data disposal section assumes a short-lived contract, 4 or 5 years, and at the termination of the agreement, the data is returned. But SIS, because of its nature, are legacy systems that go on forever, and the data can accumulate while the years go by. And I like the suggestion from Laura Pollitt that said there should be a seamless way or an easy way to delete data periodically. The other thing that I'm thinking about is when you're negotiating that contract, you've got to put more teeth into the terms of service to enforce your DPA. Many terms of service contracts have limited liability. They base it on fees paid to date. Well, that's not going to help you in a huge data breach that can be 6 or 7 figures. So what we have started doing when the negotiation of limitations of liability is to do a carve out specifically for data privacy and data security breaches. The other thing that we want to talk about is what I think we're going to have to think about going forward is to make all of this easier in terms of liability is to come up with what's called a liquidated damages formula. So one thing you could do is you could say, if this thing happens, it is expected that this will cost me $300,000 to mitigate the impact in terms of direct costs and have that built into the contract. It'd be almost like a penalty if this occurred. So you don't have to go to court and prove all of those things, evidentiary things. I would also like to have more vigorous audit provisions in the DPA, and perhaps revisiting both in the terms of service and the DPA specific data security steps that you could take. And I like the idea of the exfiltration controls, MFA, encryption at rest and in transit. I mean, things that are never going to change. We know NIST and ISO are going to change, but there's some basic good habits that should be embedded in there.
Thank you so much, Mark. That's super helpful. Toss to Heather for any last thoughts on data governance or other things that you're thinking about.
I think something unique in New York State that's in our law is our chief privacy officer at the state education department has authority for enforcement cases after a data breach or a violation of a DPA occurs. And that's really been a great opportunity for us to engage in critical conversations about what went wrong, what could vendors do differently, recognize themes, have conversations about general practices that maybe don't make sense anymore, and start applying pressure, and not just transferring that information into an enforcement case, but also, like Mark's saying, bringing it back to the contractual language, bringing it back to field practice, and really making it applicable broadly as we have those conversations. So I think it's a really nice authority that's specific to our law. Maybe a few other states have it as well, but we found it pretty impactful.
Awesome. Thank you. So I'm going to give a couple last thoughts and then toss it back because there was one more question that I want to make sure that we get that came in the chat. A couple of closing thoughts. One of the things that I've been talking about with other colleagues across sectors has been a question of criticality, right? So we want all vendors to be secure. We all want vendors to keep data private, but there are certain vendors that are more critical than others to the functioning of a school district.
Mhm.
And I think there becomes a question of, are there ways for us to start to put our arms around what that means, right? Like what constitutes a critical system in education? I've thought a fair amount about this. I know others have thought about this, but at a certain point, we need to be able to say, like, you need to be this tall and do these things if you are going to be a student information system, if you're going to be a this or that and the other thing. And again, this is not about PowerSchool as PowerSchool. This could have happened to a number of different vendors, but this is when there are 3 student information systems that basically make up 90% of the market, it means it's going to happen to one of them eventually, and it's going to have a really big impact. And so there become interesting and important questions about how do we mitigate for that kind of level of risk, from my perspective. The other piece is, as I talk to experts across cloud security and other places, no one has perfectly solved this puzzle yet. Otherwise, we would have a solution to it. But we do need to be able to band together and say, here is some industry best practice. You need to use a cloud native application protection platform, right? To be constantly scanning what's going on and mitigating against certain controls, right? And so I don't know whether or not those things were present here, but being able to ask, like, do you do these 5 things? And being able to get not just self-attestation, but like, good, prove it to me. Like, show me the thing, right? And I know that's hard to do for an individual. And Vanessa and Heather, I think you spoke to this well. There needs to be a way to kind of verify once and then use everywhere, right? Which I know is a part of what the Student Data Privacy Agreement was intended to do and does pieces of. But the same has to be true for a level of third-party audit as well, right? Because the writing of a contract is different than the auditing of the actual conformance with a set of standards, right? So those are just a couple quick thoughts that I had. There was one question here that asked, how do you get started with data governance? Was it legislatively enforced, or do you just take it on voluntarily? Does anyone want to speak to that really quickly and then close us out with any of their last thoughts?
Well, I can speak for North Carolina. It's been volunteer here. Certainly, I always want to get out in front of something before it is legislated. I always feel like if you are doing it first, you don't have to have this legislated. So certainly, we've always had data governance in place. But this has allowed us to re-examine our data governance and what that actually looks like. And certainly, you know, my goal is to move to a systemic approach to resiliency and accountability with this. And one of the things I would love to provide for our schools in North Carolina is, you know, a good housekeeping seal, if you will, that you can do business with this vendor and they have been checked out. And I know there's been many attempts at that through many different organizations, but I think that it is critical that we get there so we can have systemic controls in place.
Amazing. Any last thoughts, Heather, Mark?
You know, just to follow up on what you were saying, Michael, about coming up with additional information from the vendor about their data practices, I think we could put it into the RFP. It's kind of hard to do it in the DPA because of its length, but RFPs are lengthier and they become part of the contract document. So I think we could do a lot of scrutiny and a pre-procurement process that elicits a lot more information.
That's super helpful. I think in certain states are probably positioned better to do it than others, right? Because if I'm a small school district in in some state, the vendor's going to say, like, kick rocks, I'm not going to do this contract, right? But if you are the state of North Carolina, it might look different, right? So that's where the criticality piece comes in as well, and who can do the procurement question.
True.
Yeah. Heather, I saw you come off mute for a second. Last thought?
My last thought is just that there's a lot of work and it's growing. And I will say in our state alone, in the last 2 months, we've tackled 6 different vendor management challenges collectively. And I'm sure there were others, but those were the ones that were elevated to the centralized team. And so to do this well, you really need to expand your network. And that's why I'm thrilled you asked me to be here today so I could connect with more colleagues from across the nation, because that's the way we'll get it done, is working together.
100%. Yeah, and I think that's going to close us out, because I think from my perspective at IST and in convening what used to be the Government Coordinating Council is now the K-12 Cyber Defense Coalition. We are really interested in this question of how do we learn from this particular incident, not because it was the only possible incident, but because it's a new type of data extortion that we haven't experienced very much in this third-party cloud context. And so how can we learn together and then hopefully make some changes at a systems level, whether at the state level or at the level of regions, that allows us to collaborate and drive this work forward together. So I just want to thank you all so much for being here today. Thank you, Vanessa, Heather, and Mark, for your great input here. And thank you, everybody, for joining. We'll be sure to send some follow-up after this, and we hope to be in touch with you again soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.